On the morning of my 18th birthday, I woke up feeling completely, strangely expectant. I had always imagined turning 18 would unleash a sense of freedom, a glorious stepping stone into adulthood. The house was quiet, which surprised me because usually, birthdays meant my parents were at least bustling in the kitchen, cooking some special breakfast, or leaving a card on the table. Instead, it slightly felt as though I was the only person awake, and there was something off in the stale air. I couldn't pin down the source of my unease, so I tried to shake it off. I went downstairs, half expecting some colorful banner or an obvious envelope pinned to the fridge. Nothing greeted me except my father, who was slumped at the dining room table with a sour expression. My mother leaned against the counter, arms crossed. That was my first clue something was seriously wrong. They looked completely uncomfortable, as if delivering bad news. My father immediately cleared his throat and said, "Sit." Despite the tension in the air, part of me clung to the hope of a pleasant surprise. 18 was supposed to open doors, not slam them shut. But that day, everything crumbled. My father informed me that the trust fund my grandfather had left me was gone. I felt a sudden rush of blood to my head. That fund was supposed to pay for college and help launch my dreams. Confusion morphed into disbelief as I heard him say that they had used it to cover my older sister's mounting credit card bills. My sister, whom I loved, was disabled after a childhood accident, but she had developed a habit of overspending online. Apparently, my parents had drained $200,000 to keep her afloat. I felt my world tilt dangerously. I asked why they had never discussed this with me. My mother avoided my gaze, mumbling something about sacrifices and family priorities. My father offered a lame excuse that they had intended to replace the money someday, but they had no viable plan. Their justifications felt hollow, especially since I'd been planning my entire life around that inheritance. Watching my father's jaw clench, I wondered if he felt guilty or merely inconvenienced by my shock. Deep down, I knew I was supposed to remain calm, but the betrayal was like a punch to the gut. I couldn't contain my anger. "I needed that money," I said, voice trembling. "You completely stole my future." My mother's eyes shimmered with tears, but I couldn't muster sympathy. They had robbed me without giving me any warning or chance to object. The sense of loss spread through me like a disease. I asked if they had any intention of paying me back. My father just shrugged and said something about me finding scholarships or a job. My 18th birthday was officially turning into the worst day of my life. I rose from my chair, fists clenched, uncertain whether to explode or walk away completely. That was when my father dropped another bombshell. Since I was now an adult, I was expected to move out within the week. He said there wasn't enough space or money to support everyone comfortably anymore. My mother, instead of protesting, nodded in agreement. I stared at them, dumbfounded. They had used up my future and were tossing me aside like yesterday's news. My sister wasn't even present for this discussion. She was probably in her room, mindlessly adding more items to her online cart. Resentment began boiling inside me, fueling a new resolve. I would not accept this quietly. I left the house in a daze, wandering aimlessly through the neighborhood I'd known my whole life. Memories assaulted me. The tree where I used to build forts with my sister, the sidewalk where I learned to ride a bike. Everything felt really tainted now. I tried to figure out my next move. College applications were already in, but without the trust fund, I couldn't afford tuition. I considered calling friends, but shame rose in my throat. My parents had stolen from me, and I had no idea how to recover. I needed a plan, and I needed one fast. Eventually, I forced myself to return home, though I dreaded their voices. I wanted to gather my essentials, but found my father waiting in the living room. He thrust a duffel bag at me, filled with random clothes and personal items. He said I had a week, but apparently they'd packed me off sooner. My mother hovered behind him, refusing to meet my eyes. Anger boiled up again, but I realized there was no point in fighting. I headed upstairs to check on my sister, hoping for some shred of empathy, but her bedroom door was locked. I left quietly. I found a dingy motel that offered a discounted weekly rate, so I moved out of my car. The place reeked of stale cigarette smoke, and the walls were paper thin. However, it was better than freezing in my cramped back seat. I got a job bussing tables at a greasy diner on the outskirts of town. The pay was truly meager, but at least I could afford the motel room. Each night, I scoured the internet for scholarship opportunities, applying to every single one. My rage toward my parents never subsided. It fueled my perseverance. and I knew I wanted justice. A few weeks later, I received a surprising call from an attorney I'd never heard of. He claimed to represent my grandfather's estate. Intrigued, I arranged a meeting. The attorney revealed that my grandfather had set aside more than just a trust fund. In fact, there was a stipulation in his will that if the trust was mishandled, I would have grounds for legal recourse. My heart raced. Maybe I had a chance to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The attorney suggested we gather evidence of how the money was used. I swallowed my pride and prepared to fight back. I began documenting every instance of my sister's extravagant purchases. It wasn't her disability that bothered me, but her endless appetite for designer clothes and expensive electronics. My parents had indulged her every whim, draining the fund intended for my future. I also collected bank statements and receipts, sometimes digging through my father's trash for clues. Each piece of paper felt like a small victory, proof that they had betrayed their obligations. I no longer cared about maintaining any semblance of a relationship with them. The only thing I wanted was to reclaim the rightful money and see justice served. Meanwhile, my sister reached out to me once, leaving a voice message. She sounded contrite, stammering about how she never meant to hurt me. But it was hard to believe her sincerity when she continued flaunting new purchases on social media. I listened to her own message only once before deleting it. My parents never bothered contacting me. Perhaps they hoped I'd vanish quietly, too embarrassed or powerless to strike back. They were wrong. A simmering hatred kept me awake at night, and though it felt toxic, I embraced it. I needed that fire to stay focused on my goal. The attorney advised me to file a formal complaint in court, citing breach of fiduciary duty. We wanted to prove that my parents misused the trust for purposes not permitted by the will. I was nervous about the costs of litigation, but he assured me his firm would take a percentage of whatever we recovered. It felt like a lifeline. Through depositions, we demanded my parents produce all financial records. They tried to stonewall, but the court compelled them. When I saw the full extent of their spending, lavish vacations, top-brand gadgets, and obscene outings, I trembled with both rage and vindication. My sister was deposed as well, though she tried to play the victim. She claimed that my parents always encouraged her to spend because it made her feel better about her disability. The court showed little sympathy for that argument once they saw the blatant misuse of funds. My parents looked truly deflated when they realized the gravity of their actions. Facing potential civil judgments, they tried to settle with me. They offered a fraction of what was taken, but I refused. I wanted the entire amount, with interest. Forgiveness was never on the table, only what was rightfully mine. Despite my anger, I sometimes felt a deep pang of sorrow, remembering when we had been a family. But each reminder of their betrayal extinguished any soft sentiment. At one hearing, my mother broke down truly crying, apologizing for everything. I stood there, unmoved. She'd had months to make amends before I took legal action, yet she hadn't. My father tried to blame their financial woes on unforeseen medical expenses for my sister, but the paper trail showed otherwise. Their lavish spree was undeniable. The judge appeared disgusted by their excuses. I realized their remorse was too little, too late. Eventually, my attorney negotiated a settlement that would restore the $200,000 plus damages. My parents, desperate to avoid a humiliating trial, agreed. Part of me wanted the satisfaction of seeing them publicly shamed, but my lawyer advised that a guaranteed payout was wiser. I signed the documents with a trembling hand. Though it couldn't erase the hurt, it was a victory. The moment the money was transferred to a new account in my name, I felt a massive weight lift off me. Still, I knew this was not the end. I wanted to ensure they deeply, truly suffered. I channeled my fury into focusing on my future. With the reclaimed money, I enrolled in a decent college and rented a small apartment. But I couldn't let them off that easily. Rumors started swirling around town about why I left home so completely abruptly. People whispered that something big had happened. I allowed those whispers to spread without correction, feeding them just enough hints online to paint my parents as greedy thieves. Soon, old family friends began distancing themselves from my parents. Their social standing and irreparably eroded, and I felt a vindictive satisfaction. This was only the beginning. My sister attempted to contact me again, claiming she was facing harassment because people thought she was complicit. I listened briefly, then reminded her she was indeed complicit by enjoying luxuries paid for with my inheritance. She cried, saying she never asked for such indulgences, that it was my parents' way of making her feel less disabled. But I couldn't hear it anymore. Her tears meant nothing to me. I told her to live with the consequences. If she had any regrets, she could explain them to her credit card companies, who were now truly hounding her for unpaid bills. Time passed, and I buried myself in studies, forging new friendships with people who knew nothing of my past. I excelled academically, fueled by the bitterness that still burned inside. Now and then, I'd hear rumors about my parents struggling financially, forced to downsize completely and move into a cheaper neighborhood. Their once comfortable lifestyle had dissolved. I felt no pity. They'd gambled my future away, and they lost. Meanwhile, I got an internship with a prestigious firm, using every opportunity to improve my prospects. The bitterness remained, but it no longer defined me. My ambitions were finally in motion. But the desire for final revenge still flickered. One day, I learned my parents had approached extended family members for loans, claiming medical bills were crippling them. My father's cousin, a successful businessman, reached out to me to verify their story. I told him the unvarnished truth. They had squandered my inheritance and used disability as an excuse for reckless spending. He thanked me and rescinded any loan offer. Word spread through our extended family. Even relatives who once idolized my father began avoiding him. His pride took a crushing blow. I felt vindicated. They had completely earned this downfall. That Christmas, I spent the holiday with a close friend's family. They welcomed me warmly, and I experienced a kind of familial harmony I hadn't felt in years. It reminded me of what I had lost, yet it gave me hope that not all families were toxic. Meanwhile, my sister posted a tearful plea on social media, lamenting her isolation and lack of support. I scrolled past. The new me no longer entertained manipulative guilt trips. I was forging my own path. My parents, once so sure of their moral high ground, were left floundering in the ruins they created. In my second year of college, I decided to change my major to law. Working with the attorney on my case had sparked an interest I never knew I had. I wanted to help others who'd been cheated, to fight for people who felt powerless. My professor noticed my determination and recommended me for a competitive legal internship. I seized the chance. Each step I took advanced me further from that broken home, turning my pain into purpose. Whenever doubts crept in, I remembered my parents' betrayal. It reminded me why I refused to ever let obstacles block my progress. I rarely thought about my parents until I received an email from my mother. She wrote that my father had fallen ill and they needed financial help. She pleaded for my compassion, mentioning how they'd lost their home and were living paycheck to paycheck. Reading her words, I felt a numbness. She was the same woman who helped throw me out on my 18th birthday. I owed them nothing. My answer was simple. I never replied. The silence was my message. If they wanted mercy, they should have thought about it before betraying me. I had absolutely no obligation now. As graduation neared, I reflected on how far I'd come since that awful 18th birthday. I had a few close friends, a strong academic record, and a new sense of self-worth. My scholarship applications had been successful, so I still had some of the settlement money tucked away. Sometimes I wondered if I should feel guilt or pity for my family, but every time I recalled their faces when they told me to leave, the doubt completely vanished. I had done what was necessary to secure my future. I was not the villain here. They had written that narrative themselves. At the graduation ceremony, I was surrounded by supportive peers. I immediately felt an overwhelming sense of relief and triumph. After the ceremony, I spotted my sister lurking by the parking lot. She approached hesitantly, offering me a small wrapped box. I refused it, not wanting any token from the family that had once discarded me. She begged me to open it, tears in her eyes. I reluctantly took it, revealing a framed picture of us as children, laughing together. For a moment, I felt a nostalgic tug. Then I recalled everything that happened. I quietly handed the frame back. She asked me, voice trembling, if there was any chance for forgiveness. I simply told her that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. She tried to explain again, but I cut her off, pointing out that absolutely and nobody stood up for me when I was left homeless. I owed them nothing. I walked away, leaving her there. My hands shook, but my resolve did not. Every ounce of my being told me I had done the right thing. My parents had taught me a cruel lesson. self-preservation in the face of betrayal. I wouldn't forget it now. 2 years later, I was accepted into a top law school with an impressive scholarship package. The day I received that acceptance letter, I felt an unshakable satisfaction. My parents' actions, which had once nearly destroyed me, had instead propelled me to heights they could never have imagined. I heard through distant relatives that my father's health worsened and my mother struggled to care for him. My sister bounced between low-paying jobs, still battling debt. Not once did I consider offering them a lifeline. Some might call it heartless, but I called it justice. They had reaped their own fate. Now, on the cusp of turning 24, I look back at that fateful 18th birthday with a sense of clarity. Their betrayal was the catalyst for my transformation. Everything I've achieved since then is a testament to my refusal to bend under the weight of their greed. The settlement money was helpful, but my true wealth came from discovering my inner strength. I still remember the cold nights in my car entirely and the humiliation of being thrown out. That memory keeps my edge sharp. My parents took everything from me once. They will never take anything from me again. I've long since closed the chapter on needing their approval or love. They made their choices, and I made mine. My story doesn't end with a picturesque family reunion or tearful reconciliation. It ends with a powerful lesson about self-respect. Sometimes, the ones who claim to protect you will hurt you the most, and you must find the courage to walk away without looking back. I found that courage, and now, with my future stretching out before me like an open road, I'm completely thankful for that stolen trust fund. It gave me the fire to shape my own destiny,